We find ourselves in the summer of 2025, and summertime catechism classes are kind of more relaxed. We don't have, all of these baptisms coming up at Lazarus Saturday or at Christmas, and so we're not, going through all the various sacraments and talking about things in a more structured way. It's a little bit more relaxed in the summer, which is actually nice because I feel like I get to talk about some of the things either that you say, Father, would you talk about this for a few minutes, or things that I want to talk about. And tonight, I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects, one of my favorite people, one of my favorite saints, whom we celebrated today. We continue, sun's not down yet, so we're still celebrating him. And that is St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco, the Wonderworker. This is probably the most common icon out there that you tend to see. I have my own original icon written or painted by our own Sharon Catherine, and this is the one that I have hanging in my office. We also have a phenomenal mosaic of St. John. Can you have Tom bring me that? Would you mind?
Almost passed out when I saw
Thank you. I mean, it's Sharon Catherine's best mosaic that she's done. It was interesting because she saw this unveiling of this mosaic of St. John on the internet at a church, and she was so struck by it. I mean, it was just absolutely breathtaking. She called me. She said, Father, I sent you an email with a picture of this new mosaic that was unveiled. I want to do one just like that. So do you have your blessing to do that for the church? I said, sure, that sounds great. So she did. I think she spent like a year on it. And it's absolutely breathtaking. It's behind the altar. I enjoy his company back there. But at some point we will have it housed in a place where everybody can go and pray and venerate it. Because she put so much of her life and time and sweat into it. St. John is referred to as the Wonderworker of Shanghai and San Francisco. And when you hear people talk about St. John, they talk about him as one of the great ascetics of old. They talk about him as a desert father living in our modern times. Here is this mosaic. You just see the detail on the face. And it's absolutely phenomenal. Thank you.
God bless
Thomas
you.
Andrew. I
Yes,
appreciate
your humble
that.
servant.
Thank you. So, he's referred to as one of the ancients in our own time. And, I mean, you hear people say that and you think, well, people say these, offer these wonderful platitudes, about the saints and about their loved ones. It's like, you go to a funeral and you hear about this person and how saintly they were, and sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's a little bit exaggerated, perhaps depending on where you are and whose funeral you're attending. But the joke at a funeral is that everybody is a saint for a day, at their eulogy. I think that with St. John, when you hear these things being said about him, that he was one of the ancients, but living in our modern time, if you look at his life, you'll see that it's actually true. That St. John was he was an extremely humble man. Now, I'm not going to give a full biography today. I'm really going to just tell a couple of stories, give a few highlights. He is, again, one of my favorite topics. I love him. If you haven't read his life, you should read his life. You got to get over the hard words. Look at the glossary in the back. What do they call it when you translate the word? You say what this word means in English. What is that called? Anyway, look at that first, because I read the whole book, and I'm like, what does that word mean? And I started to understand in the context of the book, and then I got to the end, and I'm like, oh, I just should have read this first. But anyway, so there are actually a couple of books on his life that I'm aware of. The most polished one is called Man of God, and it's got a lavender cover and a photograph of St. John on the cover. So St. John lived like the ascetics of old. He fasted and he prayed the Jesus prayer. I mean, he was, I believe, would be classified as a hesychast. He was just constantly praying and fasted all the time. It is said that he never showered. If he ever took a bath, he would just take a bath in cold water quickly, get washed, get out, get on with it. That he didn't have a bed. That he didn't own a bed. That he had a chair. When he sat down to rest after liturgy on the day of his repose, he sat down in a chair. In the cathedral, he sat down in a chair to take a nap after the liturgy and fell asleep in the Lord. So he literally, you hear about these saints and you read that, some of them, they would tie a rope around themselves so that they could stand praying while they slept. And if they fell asleep, that the rope would catch them and wake them up, And you hear those stories, you're like, that's crazy. Nobody ever did that. They did. They did. Perhaps somewhere in the world they still do. I don't know, but St. John did in San Francisco, right? And he reposed in Seattle, Washington. I mean, this is the West Coast in the 60s. You remember the 60s, right? 62, Marilyn Monroe died. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis going on. We're in the heat of the Cold War. We're getting ready for the British invasion when everything would change. I mean, the 60s was a crazy time. People were like, the 60s were nuts. And they were, right? And in the middle of the 60s, in the middle of the chaos of the West Coast, we have the Wonderworker of San Francisco. I just think that's so cool. Really, it is. So St. John served as bishop in Shanghai, China, for much of his life. And I have this photograph here. Some of you may or may not know. The newer folks don't know yet. I'll show the folks who are watching at home. Look at this girl with her head turned there. You all see St. John. He's standing there as a young bishop. And there's a girl with her head turned towards him. That is Galena McLaws, our beloved Galena, one of the founders of this holy church. Her godfather and the one who baptized her was none other than St. John Maximovich, Shanghai and San Francisco. It's exciting. So St. John has a connection to this parish. Think about that for a minute. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Wonderworker, but St. John has a connection to this parish. This parish was founded, as a very unique place. It's a unique place. I love it when people come in, they're like, All Saints. That's confusing. Which one or ones? Which ones are we talking about? Because it's a unique story, that you've got this Greek family, and then you've got the Arab family, and then you've got the Russian, that was Galena, and then you've got a convert, and they get together and they say, we don't have enough Greeks, we don't have enough Russians, we don't have enough Arabs. What are we gonna do? Is this gonna be a Greek parish, a Russian? No, this is gonna be a melting pot parish. It was done that way on purpose. And so that's why this parish it's kind of unique. It has elements of all of those together. And they chose All Saints because they wanted the church to represent global orthodoxy, that it doesn't just belong to this group or that group, that it's the church serving people from all different backgrounds. So St. John then was something of a heroic shepherd. As things were getting difficult for his flock in Shanghai, he lobbied to bring them to America. He brought them through the Philippines. He actually lobbied in Washington, D.C. to bring the flock to America. He got some of them to Canada. He got some of them to America, and was an advocate for them. He was a good shepherd for his flock. I remember one of the stories from when he was back in Shanghai. They had the practice, and perhaps they still do. I haven't been to Shanghai. I've heard a lot of stories, and I don't know what is currently happening. But I know people who do, and we could ask them in a few weeks. But back to St. John. I remember a story of when St. John was in Shanghai, and one of the things that he did was he ran an orphanage. And he would go out at night. He's referred to alternately as St. John the Barefoot, because he would go out at night and he would go and walk the streets and pray. He would find homeless people. He would give them his shoes. And he was clairvoyant. He had the gift of insight. He could see the future, and he could see what they were struggling with inside without them having to tell him all the time. And so one night he goes out, And one of the things that he did was he went and looked for babies who had been exposed, right? So like you heard in old Roman times, if you had a baby and you didn't want the baby, you'd leave it on the road, and for exposure. And then people might come and rescue it. The Christians were famous for coming and rescuing the children and raising them as Christians. Well, this happened in Shanghai one night. St. John was out walking, and he heard crying of a baby. And so he went, and he can see that this sound is coming from a dumpster. And he walks over, and as he gets close to the dumpster, he hears this growling sound, and he stops. And he takes another step closer to the dumpster, and he hears the growling again, and he looks over and he sees a man next to the dumpster, presumably the baby's father, who was standing there to make sure nobody came and rescued the baby. And St. John reached in his cassock, pulled out a bottle of vodka, and tossed it. And the father grabbed it out of the air and ran down the alleyway. And St. John reached over into the dumpster and picked up the little girl and carried her home to the orphanage where she was raised by these Orthodox Christians who valued life so highly. So St. John had that kind of a heroic spirit. Now, before you think about, the strapping, you've seen the icons. He really does look big, and formidable. He was, about Grace's size, I think. He had a speech impediment, right? He had a speech impediment. His face was a little crooked. His bone structure in his face was a little bit crooked. And he was so small, actually, as a bishop, that when they put the mitre on his head, that his head would tilt to the side like this. You can see these pictures, There's even a video on the internet. I don't know if my wife found it or not. But there's a video you can see on the internet where he's at a church in San Francisco and he's blessing everybody, and he's got this big golden cross and he's struggling to lift it up because it's heavy and he's small. And he's struggling to keep his head up as the crown is tilting his head over. He was not a big, huge man. He was a little man with a speech impediment. He was a little man who had struggles. And in his weakness, God's strength was made perfect. It was shown forth through his weakness. So if ever we get in that kind of a state, the youth get in this state sometimes. I remember just the misery of, I did not like junior high school. So maybe some people have their best memories in junior high school. Junior high school for me was the closest thing to purgatory on earth. It was a horrible thing because your body's changing, you're freaking out, you're like, do I have cancer? What is happening here? And you're afraid to tell anybody about it. You're like, should I say anything or am I going to die faster if I do? And so you don't say anything. And then I remember one night, I was talking to my friend in the park. He came up to me, he's like, dude, I think I have cancer. I'm like, you too? He's like, yeah. I'm like, we both have cancer. And he's like, do you really think it's cancer? I'm like, I don't know. We should maybe ask someone. He's like, if we both have the same thing going on, I don't think we have cancer. I'm like, you're really bringing me comfort. He went on to be a priest too. A bunch of us who ran together became priests, and we all survived the puberty. Anyway, so, but junior high was a hard, crazy time. And one of the things is that when you are in junior high, that age, all these things are changing. Your brain is changing. The way you see it, the world is changing. The way that you think introspectively about yourself is changing. So you start to think about yourself in comparison to other people, in comparison, just the philosophies in your brain. Everything is changing, And so, St. John, I know I was going to make a point about this. Anybody know where I started on this?
You were describing him as not a physically formed.
Thank you very much. So when you are youthful and all of these things are changing in your brain and in your body and everything else, and you start wondering, who am I? What am I good at? Am I really pretty? Am I really handsome? Why am I so weak? Why am I so big? Why am I so whatever? And can God really do anything with me? We start thinking these things, and the devil feeds on it too. He's like, I could feed that one. We could feed that one all the way into college. And when that happens, we should think of saints like St. John, the Wonderworker, right? Who was, like Moses, slow of speech, right? But it wasn't his preaching that was powerful. He did write beautifully. He was obviously a very, very intelligent, deeply spiritual, theologically minded man. You know, you can read his writings and things, and you can see that he was right there. But it wasn't he didn't have a slick presentation. He didn't have that. He had a brokenness about him. And in spite of that, he goes down in history as the Wonderworker of San Francisco. It's beautiful. So we heard about him rescuing the baby. There are a lot of stories like that. But there were things that he did, for example, when you read accounts of his life, where people who were dying of cancer or dying of heart disease were in the hospital, and they would wake up in the middle of the night, and there was somebody praying at the foot of their bed. And they just wake up and they see there's somebody, is obviously a priest or a bishop, praying at the bottom of their bed, and go back to sleep, and in the morning they wake up healed. Against all medical possibility, right? So there are stories like that. You know, there are the people who claim to have seen him praying with his feet 12 inches off the ground, you know, in the midst of like the Paschal liturgy. Things like that. His prayers, the fervency of his prayers. There was the story that, I don't know if this was in either one of the books, I might have just heard it from one of his altar servers. You know, it's funny because, you know, now his altar servers are all old men, and so they recount stories. And one of the stories was about St. John, and he came home late one night. He'd been visiting hospitals, and he gets home, and it's something like 11 o'clock or midnight. And I know I've told this story before, but it's okay. Enjoy it a second time. He gets home, and the woman who is in charge of the orphanage comes to him, and she's upset. She's very upset because it would be a little bit like my wife, for example. Here we go. My wife loves to feed people, right? So tonight, for example, I advertised a light meal, and there's enough leftovers for everyone to go again, right? Because she loves to feed people. This woman who was in charge of the orphanage, her job was to feed the little ones. That was her job. That was where her heart was. So she had been waiting all day. There were no cell phones. Couldn't call St. John at the hospitals, track him down. So she's just worried about what's going to happen to the children. Why? Because they ran out of food. I can see the anxiety on your face, right? They ran out of food. I know. They ran out of food at the orphanage. It wasn't a laughing matter for this woman, and St. John walks in the door. She'd been waiting for him. And he walks in the door, and she says, "Where have you been?" And he says, "I've been at the hospitals praying, of course." She says, "We are out of food. The children are asleep, and they are going to starve. There's nothing to eat. And we don't have any money." You see the problem here? You see the whole like early church fathers, the ascetics. You see like the desert, you see like you bring it into San Francisco in the early 60s. And you see this scenario played out in real life. And what does this look like? What does he do? He says, "Okay." And he walks upstairs, and she can hear his feet going up the stairs. And then she hears him go into his room, close the door. He walks over to his prayer corner, and she hears, he's beginning his prostrations. He prays and prostrates until sunrise. And at sunrise, there are headlights that can be seen shining through the window of the kitchen. And there's a knock at the door. And the woman of the house hears St. John's prostration stop. And she walks over and she opens the door. And it's the Wonder Bread delivery man. And he says, ma'am, I have a problem and I'm wondering if you can help me. I'm supposed to go pick up all of the fresh pastries and breads for today, but my truck is half full from yesterday. Would you mind if I emptied my truck and left the food for you here so that I can go pick up the other food? Right? That's what it looks like. You wonder what, you read the lives of the Desert Fathers, you read these things, and you think, this is crazy. What if someone lived like that in our time? And that's the beautiful thing about St. John, is that he did. And we get to see the fruit of his labors, of his prayers, of his service, of his asceticism, of his shepherding of his flock, how many people he saved from those who were hostile against the Christians in Shanghai, how many people he saved, brought over to safety in our land. And then the other interesting thing is that the cathedral, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia Cathedral in San Francisco, had sat unfinished for years. What had happened was they had started building it, they got this big shell built, and then due to various internal struggles and strife, everything stopped. And so there it was, this big shell of a church in San Francisco. Can you imagine for years walking by it and saying, I wonder what happened that they were never ever able to finish that thing, right? It's not like the glory of the church shining with the domes for everyone to see. It's like, oh, they couldn't get it done. Until St. John came to town. And St. John came to town, he was able to bring people together and finish the project. And that is the cathedral where his relics lie in San Francisco. It's where I went and venerated him in 1995. I was on my way to a 3-week pilgrimage in the Holy Land, in Sinai in Israel. And on the way, I had a layover in San Francisco, and I thought, what am I going to do with a 24-hour layover over in San Francisco? I flew from Alaska down to San Francisco and then over through Germany and on to Israel. And so I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll get a cab and go visit the cathedral. And I did. I went over there, and it was very interesting, actually. This is funny. I don't even think I ever told you this, Mom. I walked in, to the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which unfortunately at that point was not in communion with us. Thank God that communion's been restored. But I walk in to the narthex of the cathedral, and they have an entire wall of becoming Orthodox. And I walked in and I had, wait, what? And there was this guy standing there. I won't tell you who he was, but he was standing there, and I said, hello, I'm here to make a pilgrimage. I said, look at all those books. He says, yeah, everybody's becoming Orthodox. This guy, Father Peter, wrote about it. I'm like, that's my dad. So we had a good conversation. But anyway, so then I made my way into the church, which was spectacular, of course. Anybody who's been there, it's just an amazing, beautiful, awe-inspiring cathedral. And there is St. John's incorrupt relics laid in a glass-walled coffin to be venerated. And that for me was a really big thing, because that was my first encounter with like the body of a saint or incorrupt relics. And I'm thankful I had that. It was a moving and a life-changing experience for me. And I'm thankful I had that experience, because it gave me some time to digest what had happened, what was happening, what was going on there, and just the whole thing, right? And then I landed in the Holy Land, and we spent the next three weeks venerating relics. St. Catherine of Mount Sinai, whose body is incorrupt. St. Stylianos of Mount Sinai. It goes on and on and on. So for me, St. John kind of helped to break me into that pilgrimage. And I'm very grateful for that. And one other thing I'll tell you, St. John had such an impact on my life personally that when I was living in Alaska, we lived in a place called the Holy Cross House, and it was just a bunch of young men and a bunch of young women and a priest and his family, and we all lived together. We did prayers together, and we ate together, and then we had our jobs or school or whatever, and it was just a great opportunity to grow as young people and figure out kind of how to live on your own and to have the support of one another in doing so. And it never hurts to have a priest in the house. You learn a lot from he and his family too. But so the Holy Cross house, 26 people under one roof. And so it was very difficult to find a quiet place to pray. And that was one of the things we were in the house for, was to really learn how to work on our prayer life. But it was very hard because you're surrounded by so many people. So my dear friend, Father Basil, and I, he wasn't a priest, he was just Reader Basil at the time, I think. We decided that we needed to have a place to pray. I won't tell the whole story, honey. So we went out into this house was built kind of on, looking down into a valley. And so we said, you know what? It's in the valley. There's a lot of rocks around here. There's a cave. We'll find a cave and we can pray like the desert fathers, in a cave in Alaska. Someday they'll be writing about this, right? So we go down together, we get our walking staffs, and he had a big beard already. I couldn't grow anything. And we walk together down this valley, and we're looking everywhere, trying to find this cave. We know it must be there because, of course, we have our hearts set on praying. God's going to bless us with a cave, right? So we're walking through the cave, we got our staffs, and we're looking around. Where's the cave, and asking each other, it must be over there. And we walk over, there's no cave. And so finally then, we hear this branch break above our head. This tree branch break above our heads, and we look up, and there's a branch falling out of the tree. I'm like, get out! So we jump off to the sides, and this branch comes and crashes down on the ground. And I said, what happened? And he says, it's a great horned owl. And it had hit a tree and knocked a branch off. This owl was huge. And so he says, follow the owl. So it was like Peter and John running to the tomb, right? I was 21, he was 31. And so I was running faster than he was. And I'm just running. And finally, I'm running maybe 30 seconds, and I lost the owl. I just yelled back to him. I said, I can't find the owl. He said, there must be a cave there. Look around. So we look around everywhere. We're looking for a cave and I'm like, there's just no cave here. And then all of a sudden, and this is really cool. This is kind of how God works sometimes. Like you ask him for something and he says, I have something else in mind. You say, but I really want what I want. And he says, but I have something else for you. And you say, but I really want what I really want. And this is what happened here, because I was looking for a cave and I'm standing there, and all of a sudden I look, and I'm looking at the hillside, right? And our house is up here, looking at the hillside. And there's this big arch in the side of the hill. And it was wood. What on earth? So I go in there and I kind of start picking it up. It was a giant tree had fallen over, and the root system had just arched like this. And then everything had settled for years around it. So I looked at it and I said, there's not a cave, but I'm pretty sure if we got some shovels, we could make a really cool chapel out of this thing. So we ran up and got shovels. We spent maybe an hour digging it out. And then we just built a little roof on it. And when we were done, it had 7-foot tall ceilings, right? And you could fit about 6 people in there praying together. And it was all just, the inside of it was just this beautiful arch that went into the hillside. So we didn't get a cave, but we kind of did. And we called that the Chapel of St. John Maximovich. That's the end of the story. Somewhere I've got photos of it. It was a lot of fun, but when they, it was so cold. It was so cold. So cold. When you hear about St. Herman sleeping in a barabra in Alaska, which is a hole in the ground with a board over it, you hear about that and you're like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. It was cold. We didn't sleep in there and it was cold. So anyway, but I wanted to share, that's how much he meant to us, St. John, and still does. I feel like, unworthy as I am, he's like a friend, and I believe he prays for us, for this community. I believe he and Galena pray for this community together now. And so those are my stories. There are more to share, which I won't do that tonight. But if I would recommend that anybody, if you can get your hands on it, we have it, I think, in our lending library. We used to have about 5 or 10 copies out there, that you get the book, St. John of San Francisco, Man of God. and enjoy. So that's what I had to say. Any questions before we move on to Korea's video? Yes, sir.
So you mentioned that he was part of a group or well, I know it wasn't a communion with Moscow. I don't know if it was ever a communion with anyone else at that time, but like how did that affect the relationships with the rest of the church?
Well, church history, as you know, probably is not always seamless. For example, the schism that we have going on right now, which is a horrendous situation between Moscow and Constantinople over the state of the church in Ukraine. It is horrible what's happening right now. And so we're in the middle of it, but we can't fix it. Right? We look at it and we say, this is horrendous. How can this happen? And so we pray for it to be fixed, and we hope and we pray that the leaders will get together and heal that schism. And St. John was in the middle of it and couldn't fix it. So what did he do? He lived his life to serve Christ and the church in every way that he possibly could. And I'm sure prayed for the reunion of the church, for the healing of the schism. And eventually, less than 50 years after his repose, thanks be to God, that was realized. So it would have been, like right now, what's the difference between if I'm in a Russian church in America, then I've got strained relations with the Greeks in America. Like, it's a real schism, and it affects us here. And it affected him, and he just lived in the midst of it, in spite of it, and lived through it, and became a saint in the midst of it. So, good question. Yes, sir.
What makes relics incorruptible?
Grace.
Okay.
What does that mean?
So let me ask a different question. What do incorruptible relics look like?
Oh, wow. So there are different things that happen for different saints. So like the saint, the right hand of Saint John the Baptist that baptized Christ is incorrupt, right? That means it still has its skin and fingernails on it. If you go to, for example, Saint Spiridon of Thermopylae, Saint Spiridon of Thermopylae, his skin is incorrupt. His beard still grows.
He has a normal body temperature.
He has a normal body temperature.
He wears out his garments because he gets up and walks.
Right.
Shoes.
So,
Shoes.
right.
Shoes. He has to change his shoes all the time.
So there were, I think, 2 times a year, I believe, they change his shoes. So there are different levels of incorruption. There's St. John of San Francisco. He's lying there in his coffin. His skin is dark. It's darkened skin. St. Spiridon of Thermopylae, his skin is not dark. He looks like he fell asleep. And, so there are different kind of levels of incorruption. And so St. John, his skin is dark, but he's still got his skin. He's still got his hair, his beard, and everything. He's lying there in the coffin. He should be dust by now. Okay.
Do you mind if I just share the piece from the story of St. Nectarios, that he was incorrupt for many years?
Yeah.
So St. Nectarios of Aegina was, I don't remember how many times he was exhumed, but each time he was found to be incorrupt. And X number of years after his repose, he was exhumed, and his relics were no longer incorrupt. And the nuns that had cared for him and cared for his grave and cared for his relics, the pilgrims were, grieving that his relics had become corrupt. And he came to one in a dream and told her that he had asked the Lord to allow his relics to go so that they could be distributed. And that account was recorded in Saint of Our Century, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
One of the biographies of Saint Nectarios.
Yeah.
So it's very, it's another mystery, right? If we
Right.
didn't have the relics of the saints distributed, we wouldn't have the relics of the saints distributed.
Right.
So we wouldn't have a relic. And would you mind, since we're on relics,
Mhm.
would you please explain to us the relationship between a relic and a consecrated altar? Where is the relic? How do we receive a relic? What determines what relic a church has?
Sure. So first, briefly, relics. In Scripture, you find, for example, Elisha, if you know the story of Elisha's bones, that is told in which book of Kings is it? Anybody remember where it is? Somebody will, never mind, don't Google it. You guys at home will figure it out. So where Elisha's bones are, had been, buried, they're in a cave, basically, area. And a funeral procession comes by, and then the men who are carrying the body in the funeral procession see robbers coming, who are coming to, pillage the graves. And so they're like, quick, and they take the body and they quickly throw it into a cave and then take off. Well, the body lands on the bones of Elisha. And then the man comes back to life, because the bones of Elisha were sanctified, right, by the Holy Spirit. And so they were relics of him, and they caused life to be brought back into this man. And so the relics in the church, it's always been something, if you think about, even the tombs of the prophets, when I was in Jerusalem and went to and saw the tomb of David, there, and the tomb of the Theotokos and of Joachim and Anna, and all of these different ones. It's from ancient times and beyond. You've got the reliquaries of the saints. And so in the early church, you had the Christians forced underground, often worshiping down in the catacombs. And so you would have, a body and then a slab above the body, and they would actually have their service, like they use that as the altar, and actually have their communion service there. And you can even see some of the ancient frescoes, above the tombs down in the catacombs. And so once the church has kind of moved above ground and were able to function within society, like post-Constantine, where there was no longer a widespread persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, even though there were still pockets here and there, it became the practice that you would take the relics of the saints from the catacombs and bring them and put them in your altars in the churches. And so every church, every altar has a relic of a saint. So we're not a consecrated church yet, but we have a relic of Saint Raphael in our altar, which will ultimately be moved when we build our new temple. And we have a relic of one of the 20,000 martyrs of Nicomedia in our altar. And so, which is why, if anybody noticed, last year I added an icon back there, and it's always got this little red candle burning in front of it. That's the icon of the 20,000 martyrs of Nicomedia. I feel like they're with us, because they're there. They're right here in front of us, right? They're right there with us, and so I really feel like they're with us. It's not just it's not just kind of some kind of an empty tradition. It's a real connection there. So the relics, the bishop chooses which relics to send us. I remember somebody, when the bishop was giving us the antimension, which is the cloth that you have to have on your altar in order to serve communion. It's your blessing from the bishop for you to serve a liturgy. And it's got his signature on it and everything. And he put in it a relic. And I remember, when they were distributing the antimencia, they were distributing them to the priests. And I heard someone say, let me see, okay, which relics do you have? And I was like, wait, there are more than, what do you mean? What? He says, well, let's see, you're in the Midwest. That means you either have the 40 Holy Martyrs of Sebast or the 20,000 Martyrs of Nicomedia. I'm like, wow, okay, great. Either one works wonderfully for us, of course. And so we end up with the 20,000 Martyrs of Nicomedia. And so when we serve the liturgy, we're serving the liturgy on the bodies of the saints in the catacombs, like they did in the second century church. It's a beautiful connection back to there. So the bishop gets to decide